I'm currently teaching a class on church history, a Sunday school class on church history. And when Jeremy asked me last week to say a couple things, it was interesting that it occurred at this time because I viewed this ministry through a lens that perhaps I might not have had I been asked at a different time. But I think that this subject is one that we fail to give much attention to notoriously in this country. I think that Christians tend to yawn, and I can tell you from experience that we have extra seats available in this class. Lots of extra seats. My point is that whenever you decide to teach a class on church history, you have to set aside some time at the outset to explain why it is important to even look at church history. Why is it relevant? I mean, we have scripture, right? So why bother? But the fact is that there are lots of marvelous reasons and very practical reasons for us to look at the experience of the church over the past 2,000 years. And there's so many ways in which we can find negative and positive examples which will provide wisdom and experience for us to look forward into the future. I want to focus on one dimension of that experience in particular, and that relates to strategies in which the church has attempted to fulfill its great mission. We might call it its great commission, right? And there has been a checkered history of somewhat over time, but there are a few principles that have emerged that are beyond question. And one of those principles is the idea that it's imperative that the church meet unbelievers where we find them. And we find them at different times, and we find them at different places. But the bottom line is that we have to develop a methodology that incorporates the particular obstacles to their faith that exist at that time and place. Paul certainly knew this in the first century. In the first century, imagine the difference between Paul's approach to evangelism when he's in Jerusalem and he's talking to Jews, for example, and when he's talking to people with whom he shares a common source of authority, right? Scripture. So that's a different approach than the one he used at Mars Hill. When he's at Mars Hill in Athens, Greece, what did he appeal to? He appealed to reason because the Epicureans, the Stoics, they weren't prepared to acknowledge any authority in this thing called the Bible, the Old Testament at the time. But they were respectful of reason. So if you fast forward to the 21st century, we can look at how missions work varies depending on where you are. I mean, evangelism looks much different, for example, in the Congo versus Jordan versus China versus France. And even in the same place over time, we see a lot of variation. Let's take Europe over the last several centuries. Europe has cycled from unbelief to belief to violent belief, then back to unbelief. So if the church is on the ground at any one of those periods, its approach to evangelism will look a little different. I mean, fundamentally, the gospel is the same, but I'm suggesting to you that we have to be adaptive if we're going to succeed in the responsibility that all of us have to be evangelists in our day. So what can we say about America? I mean, I think that we can say that America is not immune to these laws. I think that America has changed. I think that the 21st century looks different from the 20th century. I mean, if you were approaching an unbeliever in the mid-20th century, you could take certain things for granted. You could assume that they're probably churched. If not churched, they're probably theistic. And in any case, they've grown up in a culture that is saturated with Christianity. It doesn't mean it is Christian, but it means that it's a Christianized culture. So it's a more hospitable environment to talk about our faith. When you fast forward to the 21st century and as we move ahead with Generation Z and beyond, I suspect that we cannot start at the same place. I think that we're going to have to approach this differently. I think the obstacles to faith will look different over the next 50 years than they did the prior 50 years. Now that brings me to Faith Ascent. Now we tend to at these events emphasize the fact that Faith Ascent is devoted to fortifying our children and our grandchildren in their faith, strengthening them in a way that they can survive and even prosper in the inhospitable environment of college campuses today. In other words, it's to combat head-on these attrition rates that are shocking, that we all know about. If you've supported this ministry for any period of time, you're familiar with those. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's a much more exciting reason to support this ministry. One, in fact, that no doubt God has in mind. And that's that from his perspective, our children, our grandchildren are probably a means to an end. It's critical that we preserve their faith. It's critical that we fortify them, but it's toward a greater end. And this ministry is uniquely positioned to equip its best and brightest with a message and a methodology that is specifically designed to address the particular obstacles of faith that we'll confront in America over the next 50 years. So I'll conclude with this. I think that we have to be prepared to accept the reality that things change over time. We can't disregard the lessons of Paul in 2,000 years of church history. And this ministry is uniquely positioned to undertake that challenge. And it's for that reason that we need your support. Thank you.
I want to thank Jeremy again for asking me to give the invocation tonight. When he asked for sort of my ministry credentials, my bio, in framing up this introduction, I told him let's just kind of downplay that. Not only because I'm a pastor and we're supposed to boast only in the Lord, not in our credentials, but really because my credentials are not that impressive. I have not written books like Sean and Josh, our keynote speaker from last year. I don't have a long trail of initials following my name in your program there. I'm just a pastor and saved by grace, like so many of you here this evening. And more relevantly to our topic for this evening, I was, in all likelihood, looking back over my story, saved by grace just about 7 or 8 years ago. After finishing divinity school, I told my wife 9 years ago, after graduating from seminary, that I was giving up on Christianity. I was done. Despite being raised in the church, after 7 years of liberal universities and training, I had made shipwreck of whatever little faith I had going into that. And so that's why I'm here tonight. Faith Ascent was the ministry I needed when I was in high school and didn't have. And so that's why I support them today. And I hope that tonight you will choose to do so as well. So let's pray. Father, you are a good and gracious and awesome God. You alone are worthy of our praise, our attention, our affection, our hearts. Father, we are all sinners who, but for the grace of God, we know what we deserve and where we would be. And so, God, it is only by the precious blood of your Son, Jesus Christ, that we can boldly approach your throne tonight, the imputed righteousness of Christ, that we can come to you tonight asking you. Your word commands us to ask and we will receive. And so tonight, Father, I want to ask you for something. We want to ask you to do something tonight in the hearts of the people represented in this room. I think of your word. Luke 10:2 tells us the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Pray earnestly that the Lord would send out workers. And so, Father, tonight I want to pray and ask you and beg you that you would call and motivate, stir hearts of workers in this room. We can't all be Jeremy Smiths. We can't all be the farmer in charge of all of it, but we all have our parts to play. And so, Father, whatever part you would have for us to play tonight, I pray for obedience. I pray for open, softened hearts to the Holy Spirit's leading and calling. And Father, I pray you would do a great work through the ministry of Faith Ascent and through this event in using it powerfully to call young people to yourself. We know that the harvest is, in fact, plentiful. We hear it, those of us who are pastors, in the questions of the teenagers in our youth groups. We hear it in their confusion in the world that they're growing up in today. They need answers. They're begging for answers. You are the answer. And this ministry is all about connecting them to you. And so, Father, I want to pray your blessings over Faith Ascent, over Jeremy, over his team, over this evening, and over this meal. Would you bless it to the nourishment of our bodies and our bodies to your service? It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
If you notice that I didn't shake David's hand, it's because I'm feeling a little under the weather. So if you guys could pray for me. If I wasn't shaking your hand tonight, it's because I'm trying to spare you from what doctors and experts call the man flu, which is far worse than the flu that you ladies get. Where's Josh Swamadas? Is that scientifically proven, Josh, that guys get hit with the colds and flu even worse than ladies? All right, well, we'll talk later. Anyway, so jokes aside, thanks for praying for me, everybody that has been. It's been kind of a rough week, but I'm so glad to be here. Thank you guys for coming. Man, this is a packed house. This is a great crowd. I really want to liven it up a little bit. You guys know... Oh, is there no mic? Hey, I'm Jeremy. Were you guys able to hear what I said prior to... Okay, good. I don't have to go back. So David talked about our mission and vision, and since 2010, Faith Ascent has been fulfilling this mission and vision through our programs. This would include, and I'll talk more about this, but it's our student surveys, our church and school seminars, of course, our summer camp. You guys, most of you know about Base Camp. Small groups, college connections, and I'll talk a lot more about our program outputs a little bit later tonight. But right now, let me just set the stage for tonight's conversation with Dr. Sean McDowell. In May of this year, and I'm not sure if we mentioned this, but this is like the 10-year anniversary dinner for Faith Ascent, so that's exciting. In May of this year, I celebrated my 10-year anniversary with the ministry, and it's been a wild ride. I mean, for almost a decade, I've been pounding the pavement, trying to convince pastors, parents, and Christian educators that youth ministry is in dire need of a reformation. So I think that, let me say it this way. I'd like to think that the growing interest in our ministry and ministries similar to ours is because I've spent so much time calling and talking to folks like you. But I think there are other factors at work besides just me pounding the pavement. We're in a very unique cultural moment, as Mr. Cordell said. We're really in the right place at the right time with the right programs. And back in 2010, some of you remember this, incorporating Christian apologetics into youth ministry was not really a common practice in our circles of influence locally. Certainly there are several apologetics-related ministries for adults, but there wasn't a lot being offered to young people. And real quick, by the way, when I say apologetics, I know that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So let me just define my terms. When I say apologetics, I simply mean offering a word back, or offering a defense, or offering a response, or answering questions. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer, a word back, a reply, a defense to anybody that asks you the reason for the hope that you have in Jesus, but do this with, you guys know the rest, gentleness and respect, right? So that's what I mean about apologetics. And when we first started, I was under the impression that apologetics was simply, big, really fancy concepts like the teleological argument, the ontological argument, the kalam, cosmological argument, the moral argument, the evidence for the resurrection, the problem of evil and suffering, and if you're, really cutting edge, maybe, sexual ethics. And that's what I thought apologetics was. Now, after hundreds, maybe thousands of surveys with students, I've realized that while apologetics is not less than those topics and categories, it is just so much more. It's so much more. So that's what I mean when we say apologetics. And our first summer camp, I think locally, it broke the mold. It was an exciting endeavor. It was different. And we hired professors, we hired apologists and Christian intellectuals to teach and minister to college-bound Christian teenagers. And it really was a novel concept in our city. Sean, we're not as cool as you guys in California, right? We're always like 10 years behind the curve of the coasts, but I have some photos here. Look at these young guys. Look how handsome they were. Remember that, Sean? That's our very first summer camp. That was 2010. We had 30 students that attended, and and in that picture on the bottom right, I'm not sure why, but everybody in that picture, except for Sean, is wearing cargo shorts. It's embarrassing, but it's there. Our students spent a week wrestling with the biggest questions that Christian teens were asking at the time, and the big questions that they were being asked by their non-Christian friends. So let's jump in our DeLorean and our time machine, and let's travel back to 2010 when Faith Ascent launched. Like I said, here in the Midwest, sometimes we're a decade or so behind, but at the time that we launched, at the time that Base Camp was happening here, the new atheist movement was really peaking on college campuses all over the country. And it was starting to impact the conversations that our young people were having. Authors and speakers like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, they were touring college campuses, and some of you guys remember this. Almost like rock stars. Conversations were happening all over college campuses. These guys were getting booked left and right. They're selling books, and a lot of this information was kind of trickling into conversations in our churches. And at that time, Barna and other sources, they were just shouting from the rooftops that at least 60% of professing Christian teenagers were not going to carry their beliefs into adult life. And most of them were saying that intellectual skepticism was a major deciding factor. And so, pastors and parents in our context were just starting to come to terms and come to grips with this mass exodus of 20-somethings from the church and this new wave of questions that were popping up in youth groups around the dinner table. So instead of the standard questions that the boomers in the room were trained to answer, questions like, where would I go if I died tonight? You ever heard that one? I know the CBMC folks have heard that one. Stan Bauer, that's his magic question. Or questions like, which Bible translation is the best? Or how do I find a good spouse? Or how do I pick a good church? Or for my Presbyterian friends in the room, how do I spot and refute heresy? Or for my Baptist friends in the room, how do we convince those Presbyterian folks that Jesus was only drinking grape juice, right? These were the big questions. But things changed. Joe talked about our cultural moment, and instead of those standard questions, pastors and parents were hearing a lot of questions and objections that were maybe more informed by the new atheist movement, and also probably shifting sexual norms. So questions like, how do we know the universe was really created? Questions like, how do we know the Bible is accurate and reliable? Or how do we know Jesus really rose from the dead? Or maybe, how do I love my gay and lesbian neighbors? So most of you that were involved with Faith Ascent in the early year, and I know Ed and Letitia and Conway and others are in the room, and Sean, of course, who was there that first year. Maybe you agree with me when I say that, like, 2010, 14, at least in Faith Ascent terms, those seemed like simpler times when students were asking simpler questions. I think about those times as like the good old days, believe it or not. Not to say that those questions weren't important, but they weren't really new. Think about it. The new atheist movement wasn't new at all in terms of the questions that were being raised or the objections. We literally had, and Sean knows this, we literally had libraries full of good answers to those questions and objections written by tons of faithful Christian apologists. Now, yeah, for sure, that brand of cold, hard skepticism hit the church really hard. No denying that. But the problem back then was not the lack of answers. The problem wasn't a lack of resources. The problem was really a lack of awareness, a lack of preparation, and sad to say, a lack of motivation. Well, it didn't take long for not just the pastors and the parents, but every Christian in this room to find all the awareness and all the motivation that they would ever need. Because everybody here probably, unfortunately, can put a face and a name to these stats. And it took a couple of years for our local churches to catch on, but I've been spending the last several years, probably 6 years, just trying to keep up with the calls and trying to provide the best possible programs to the kids that we all care about. And by the way, when I say this is a team effort. I know I get a lot of credit. I'm kind of the face of the organization, but there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes. We have other folks, volunteer staffers, etc., that don't get nearly enough credit. I'll talk about them later in the night. But let me just say, while our mission and vision informs all of the programs, including our surveys, seminars, small groups, more on that later, the heartbeat of Faith Ascent, and you guys know this, the heartbeat of Faith Ascent is best heard when you listen to what's happening at Base Camp, which is our flagship program. It's our annual program. This is our Base Camp timeline, and it might be hard to see, but since 2010, we've hosted 10 different camps here in St. Louis and 2 in Arizona. So that's 12 total, and we've served just about 700 students through Base Camp. It's a lot of kids. For those of you that aren't, and I know there's some new people here too, if you're not familiar with Base Camp is 5 days and 4 nights of fun and fellowship and all the things that you would expect from a Christian summer camp aimed at teens. But most importantly, it's intense preparation for the challenges, of course, but also the opportunities that college is going to present to these young people. Here is a short video.
How do I know the Bible's reliable?
Christian sexual ethics are so outdated.
Are science and faith compatible?
That may be true for you, but that's not true for me.
Why would a good God allow evil and
All
suffering?
Christians are homophobic.
Were the disciples telling the truth?
Is Jesus really the Son of God?
Is God mad at me for having doubts?
So that is our most recent Base Camp promotional video. For 10 years, We've been working hard to fulfill this mission of ours, to help students to really think through their biggest questions and their doubts about Christianity. And let me tell you, while our core convictions and our philosophy of ministry, these things haven't changed, the kinds of questions that Christian teens are asking and being asked have changed a lot. Has anyone else noticed? Some of you that are in ministry, I'm sure you've noticed. So I talked about the good old days, right? When we were answering questions and addressing objections informed mostly by guys like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. Again, challenging questions and ideas to be sure, and we do need to take these questions seriously still, even now. But there was no shortage of scholarly and well-resourced answers to these questions. Well, we went from that, and I think this really started happening around 2014, at least in our context. We went from that to the cultural moment that we find ourselves in today. Now we're answering questions and addressing objections informed by factors that are far more complex than anything a student can find in a Richard Dawkins book. And while answering questions that young people are asking sometimes feels like kicking at a moving goalpost, it's critical. It is critical that we pay close attention to the cultural conversations happening, not just inside of the church, but outside of the church. Now, there's nothing new under the sun. I believe that. But as I like to tell pastors and parents, the shadows do cast different shapes depending on what time it is. What cultural moment are we in? As one apologist puts it, Bill Craig says, the gospel is never heard in isolation. It's always heard against the background of the culture in which one lives. And this, my friends, is the background noise that's buzzing in the ears of our young people, even our young people in the churches. And some of us may be tempted to think that these conversations are silly. And I'm going to tell you now the same thing that I've been telling pastors and parents and youth pastors since 2010. We have to love young people enough to take their questions and their doubts seriously. That dismissive posture that we're all tempted to have, that's what costs us a lot of the Gen Xers and Millennials. And we don't want to repeat that with Gen Z and I think the next is Gen Alpha, right? That's what they're saying, right? So with that said, Sean McDowell and his dad Josh, they've been dedicating, I would say, the better part of their lives to helping all kinds of people, not just Christians, but non-Christians too, to think through the big questions of the faith. Questions people are asking and being asked, and both of them have really helped Faith Ascent tremendously over the years. And before I bring Sean up, let me just say too that in this room, I know we have a lot of prior base camp speakers, and I'm, you don't have to stand up or anything, but I just want to say that besides our students, our speakers are our greatest asset. I have to tell you, we've been uniquely blessed here in our city to have some of the smartest, wisest, most faithful and loving professors, authors, pastors, apologists. We are really, really blessed. And I've got a slide here of some of our credentialed speakers. And I run this joke every year, but you can see by reading that we have very strict criteria when it comes to picking these speakers. So anyway, if you guys could just take a moment to thank our base camp speakers in the room with a round of applause. I know there are about 4 or 5 of you here, probably more. Sean's new book that he co-authored with J. Warner Wallace is called So the Next Generation Will Know, subtitled Preparing Young Christians for a Challenging World. And that book's available. Those of you that registered before October 1st, should have a free copy. If you didn't get that, make sure to come see me or one of us before the night's up. But that book title is actually the working title for our event tonight. Sean, first of all, thank you very much for flying out. I know you're really busy.
Well, this is important. I can't believe 10 years has gone by.
No.
Awesome.
I tried to dig up the base camp video that you did for us. It was like a shaky cell phone, like Blair Witch Project sort of looking thing.
That's awesome.
But, no, it was really good, but I couldn't find it. So
good. I'm actually glad that you can't find it.
But I did have the pictures of us when we were 10 years younger.
That's pretty cool.
It was cool. So I'm going to start out, and by the way, everybody, so we're just going to have a dialogue and a chat, way more interesting than a monologue, even though Sean's a very gifted speaker. I'm going to throw you a real light, just fluffy softball question, okay?
All right, okay.
All right, so you shared before that there was a time in your life when you decided that you weren't sure Christianity was true. Mm-hmm. So take us back to that Crossroads conversation that you had with your dad.
Sure.
Josh McDowell, for those of you that don't know. I think you were in Colorado. Yep. Tell me about how that conversation or that chat informed your current passions and your philosophy of ministry.
Yeah. So my dad, you heard the name Josh McDowell, written a ton of books on apologetics, is now in, I think, 50-some years with Campus Crusade for Christ. Growing up, I don't even remember when I first became a believer. My parents tell me I was 4 or 5. I probably thought in high school someone wasn't a Christian because they just hadn't read my dad's book. Like, how hard is it? And then all of a sudden in college, like mid-90s, this is when you could start surfing the internet. And the secular web actually began, that people were taking a chapter at a time of my dad's books, historians, philosophers, doctors, etc., and dissecting it. And I read this, and I remember thinking, whoa, I've never heard this before. And it really kind of unsettled my faith. I knew my parents meant well, but I thought, for the first time in my life, what if they're wrong? Like, this changes everything. And so we're in Breckenridge, Colorado, and I just asked my dad if we'd go out to coffee. And I said something to the effect of, Dad, I want to know what's true, but I'm not sure.
How old were you?
I think I was 19.
Okay.
About my sophomore year. And I just said, Dad, I want to know it's true, but I'm not sure that I'm convinced Christianity's true. And you got to realize, my dad is a person who's like, the glass is 99% full. That's his philosophy of life. Always sees the good. And he looks at me and goes, son, I think that's great. And I remember going, like, did you actually hear what I said? I'm not rejecting this, but I don't know if I buy it. And he goes, son, I've raised you to seek after truth, to love after truth, and to follow truth. You can't live on my convictions. You've got to find what you think is true and live for it. And he said 2 other things. He said, don't reject what you've learned growing up just for the sake of rebelling. Only reject it if you're utterly convinced it's not true. And then he said, and you know your mom and I love you no matter what. And I knew that in my head, but I remember really experiencing at that moment going, wow, this is real at this stage. And that was really when I started reading and interacting with a lot of just different religious texts, feeling like, I got to know if this is true for myself, if I'm going to live this out.
That's excellent. Confident curiosity.
Yeah, that's what my parents always taught me. Read both sides of an issue and seek after truth. And in fact, the other thing my dad said, he goes, look, I'm confident you'll stay in the faith if you seek after truth because Jesus is the truth. Yeah. He showed a confidence to engage the ideas. Yeah. Which is what we should have as Christians.
Yeah, I mean, if it's true, then things like science, philosophy, history really shouldn't worry us.
That's right.
Yeah. That's right. So in 2015, you and your dad, you had a dinner conversation here in St. Louis with us. And then, too, you guys were both wearing sneakers. I wish I could get away with that. But, because it's hot in here. Is anybody else? I wish I didn't have this jacket and this suit on.
You're working hard, man.
Yeah, it seems like it. Anyway, you said at that event, so I'm going to have you interact with your own quote, right?
Okay.
How meta.
All right.
A recent study showed, this is what you said, that creating space for students to doubt and ask questions is critical.
That's right.
You said ministries like Faith Ascent take students seriously and help them to think through the answers to the big questions. So Sean, just how important is it to create safe spaces for Christians to wrestle with doubts and questions?
You know, what's ironic is sometimes in the church, we're afraid of doubt. We're afraid of asking questions. I've heard Gary Habermas has done a lot of work on this. He says people can confess almost any sin, but if you say that I'm doubting and I'm not sure, it's like people freak out. The irony is that Christianity is actually true, And if there's any place that it should be okay to wrestle with tough ideas, it should be the church, because Jesus claimed to be the truth. We shouldn't be afraid of ideas that challenge our beliefs. So studies consistently show that it's not doubt that shipwrecks a kid's faith. It's unexpressed doubt that shipwrecks a kid's faith. What that means that should be liberating to you and me is that we don't always have to have all the answers. Look, I'm an apologist. I have a Ph.D. in this. Sometimes I get asked questions, I'm like, man, that's a good question. I got to think about that. I don't know, and that's okay. So what it means is in our families and our churches and our ministries like Faith Ascent, are we going out of the way to help kids wrestle with the big questions, give them space, but also direction how to find answers. That can be life-saving for a kid's faith. It can be life-saving.
Amen. We've had more than a few students tell us that their experience at base camp was one of the first times that they just felt free to unpack some of the stuff that they had been burdened with. And we're happy to actually do that for students. And for some of them, would you agree that it's actually nice to maybe get out of mom and dad's dining room or youth pastor Bob's, a small group, because, in a context where you're known by everybody, and there might be, ramifications or raised eyebrows, it's nice to get into a group where you're somewhat anonymous, where you can just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, without fear of maybe consequence.
Look, I grew up with a father who was and still is an apologist, but when I went through doubts, I needed my dad there, but I needed other people to speak into my life, to say the same things that he had said, but sometimes hearing it from somebody else in a different setting, in a different way, makes it sink in. So that's why ministries like Faith Ascent are important. I mean, Jesus said, what do you say, a prophet is not welcome in his own country? Sometimes my kids look at me, they're like, oh, whatever, and then they'll say something in Bible class like, Dad, did you know this? I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure we've had this conversation a lot, but someone else speaking it into them is, for whatever reason, God uses that. So that's why it's so important.
I mentioned earlier that one of our core values as a ministry is community, particularly a community of Christian scholars that are willing to make themselves accessible. And actually forgot to flip the slide, but it's nice that these folks are still here, because these are local folks that are very accessible to not just students, but to me, and to some of the pastors and parents in our network. Recently, you wrote a blog about staying in your lane, right? And it was more about, how do you get so much done being busy? And you mentioned that it was important to stay in your lane, focus on what you are good at. How important, Sean, is it for pastors and youth pastors to resist the temptation, or maybe you could say the pressure, to tackle every philosophical, scientific, and historical topic alone?
How great is the pressure to do that?
Yeah, so let me say it again.
Okay.
A lot of youth pastors, I've noticed, in our context, maybe you've realized this, they feel like they have to be all things to every kid.
Got it.
Every question that comes up, they feel like, oh, I have to study. I have to be the expert. I have to be Josh or Ravi or Bill Craig or whoever it is, right? How important is it to outsource, to invite others in, experts?
So here's the balance. What can happen is when people don't feel like they're an expert on something, they never talk about it. That's a mistake. Or they talk about it as if they know and they're the expert when they're not. So interestingly enough, in David Kinnaman's research, you cited Barna earlier, they said that 50% of Christian youth today want to go into some type of science-related field. Maybe it's research, maybe it's in medicine, maybe it's engineering. Yet over the past year, and this research was 3 or 4 years ago, over the past year, the number of youth pastors who have addressed a science-related topic was 1%. Can you imagine that? 1% according to his research. So one problem is people don't talk about it. The other problem is people will talk about issues in a way that they haven't really studied and don't know, and then students get outside of the youth group, hear something different from a professor, and they not only lose confidence in that youth pastor, whoever it is, that adult in their life, that's the person who represented Christianity. So they lose confidence in their faith in light of that. That's why experts coming in going, hey, let me tell you, this is what I've studied, this is what I know, who have relationships, who are likable, who are caring, not only give them good arguments, but kind of incarnate that and give students something to look up to, something to emulate personally. That's the power of it.
Yeah. I learned early on that I am not the guy to go into a church and talk about science,
Okay.
New Testament textual criticism, or what have you, right? I have a
Okay.
couple of things that I feel comfortable discussing.
Sure.
And I've been really, really blessed locally to have so many different, as I said earlier,
Good.
pastors, professors, etc. So thanks for reinforcing that. One of the areas, Sean, I think that you really shine, and I watch a lot of your videos. You have public conversations with people that you strongly disagree with. You recently had a discussion with Matthew Vines on the issue of homosexuality in the Bible, on the live version of the Unbelievable show, right, with Justin Brierley. There was a guy named Ryan Bell, right, that was a former pastor turned atheist.
This guy was a pastor for 20 years, and he did an experiment of being an atheist for a year. No one's going to decide what he believes. CNN covered it, a bunch of other places, and of course he ended up becoming an atheist. So we had a live conversation. It was so interesting on so many levels.
I agree. How important is it? How important is it for churches and different Christian ministries to invite outsiders in so that Christians can publicly interact with their ideas with gentleness and respect?
If I was a pastor, and I'm not, one of the things I would do is probably once a month, bring in people on the most divisive, divided issues. Let's talk about immigration. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about LGBTQ. Let's talk about whatever it is and model civil, loving engagement amidst serious disagreement. I've done formal debates, and I don't think I'm going to do any formal debates anymore. I think there are people who should do those. But I think what speaks to this culture is when people can look at each other and disagree fiercely, but still treat each other with dignity, treat each other with kindness. And frankly, the stereotype of Christians is like, well, Angela in The Office, right? Angela in The Office is the Christian. So when Christians, uptight and judgmental and shallow and hypocritical. So when Christians can actually converse on an issue and give a point, not feel like they need to win, so to speak, and be loving, that I think speaks volumes for the gospel and just gives the church confidence to engage these issues. Sometimes we're afraid to even talk about them. And I think the reason we're afraid to talk about them is because we don't really know what we believe and why. One of my favorite things to do in churches is I put on glasses and I do this atheist role play, and I invite questions from the audience and I just shoot down. And after like 25, 30 minutes, people would get like noticeably upset with me. I've had people yell across the room. I've had people call me names, and they know that I'm role playing. And I push some buttons. I know how to do that, but I'll step out of character. And my first question is, how did you treat your atheist guest? And the looks on people's faces are like, oh my goodness, not in a Christ-like manner. And I'll say, why? And I think the answer, we get defensive and we get upset when we don't know what we believe and why. So sometimes as a church, we keep the ideas out there because it's easier to stay in our safe bubble. That is a massive, huge mistake today. It's a huge mistake on so many levels. So any ministry to me that loves students and loves worldview and says we're not afraid to talk about these topics, I'm in. I'm in. And that's what I love about Faith Ascent.
A few years back, Dr. McClyman, where's Mike? Is he here? Yes. You remember this, Mike. We had a panel discussion. It was you and Letitia and I think Ed Bowen and three local atheists. And two of those guys were my friends.
Wow.
And I thought, and this was probably 2012, Mike? Would that sound about right? And this was not at a church, by the way. Like, we rented some space.
Good.
We had about 50 students in the room, some parents. I got an email from a pastor a couple days after, and he said something along the lines of, that I had soiled the pulpit by allowing atheists to talk to our parents and students. We did another thing. We partnered with a local ministry called Midrash, and we had Matthew Lee Anderson. You've heard of?
Yeah,
Matt? Yep.
I know Matt well.
So him and John Corvino did a talk.
Yes, that's
John,
awesome.
What's he known for, John? He's the
issue of same-sex marriage and homosexuality.
Yeah, he's like the spokesperson.
Yeah,
like YouTube famous.
That's right.
And he's a professor. I can't remember the university, but anyway. So him and Matthew did this conversation, and they were engaging in friendly dialogue. John stayed at Matthew's house.
Wow.
And Matthew's like, yeah, like this is my friend. I disagree with him deeply, and yet I love him. He's an image bearer. Yep. I'm going to continue to try to convince him of the truth of the gospel, but in the meantime, like I love him. It's just so important, and I've noticed that over the last few years, less pushback on the dialogues. I think more people are catching on. Do you see that in your context too?
Yes and no. So the different issues you have to deal with differently. It's one thing to bring in an atheist because you know exactly where an atheist stands. I had a conversation with a quote gay Christian who says the Bible is okay with same-sex relationships.
Matthew Vines?
With Matthew Vines. That's very different because you know exactly where the atheist stands spiritually. But when somebody says I'm a Christian and the Bible approves of same-sex relationships, that's a very different dynamic. There's a lot of concern in the church about that conversation. I frankly think a lot of it is motivated by fear. We're motivated by fear. Well, what's the response to fear? What does 1 John 4 say? Perfect love casts out fear. The response is love. So we have to know what we believe and have the courage to engage people. I don't agree with the pastor who said you shouldn't have an atheist in, but I understand the instinct of defending the flock.
Yeah.
Because Richard Dawkins wrote his book, The God Delusion, to talk kids out of their faith. That's why he wrote it. Now, I took students a semester through a Christian apologetics book, and then we did Richard Dawkins' book. This is a high school group. And their response was, they said, Mr. McDowell, I'm really disappointed. Is this all he has? Like, these are high school students telling me this. And I said, well, there are smarter, more articulate atheists. Like, he doesn't represent all of them. But it also shows we shouldn't be afraid to do this if we train students, if we build relationships with them. That's the key that I think makes a difference. And obviously, that's what you guys are doing. Maybe the pastor didn't have the context for that.
Well, it was a long time ago, and I know he was well-meaning. Last question.
And you can't let one ruin all the other positive things, right?
Clearly I didn't, because we kept doing it.
Good.
So, last question, kind of 2 or 3-parter here. You recently co-wrote the book with J. Warner Wallace. What's the title again?
So the next generation will know.
And in your estimation, talking about the next generation, what are the big differences between Gen Xers, Millennials, and Gen Z in terms of what makes them unique and how they filter and process truth claims?
So one of the things I do when I speak to audiences, I'll ask adults, I'll say, give me words that describe the Gen Zers in your life, who are basically upper elementary through college. Now, I won't do this here, but the most common words are entitled, spoiled, blinded, 90% negative. So I'll let it go on for a while, and then I'll stop and I'll say, you know, how you view this generation shapes the way you relate to them. If you view them negatively, you're going to treat them that way. And if there's anything true about this generation, I think they value authenticity, and they can smell a fake. So my first approach is we can talk about uniquenesses to this generation. I was speaking on Gen Z in New Zealand, and a girl came up to me afterwards. She was in tears. She said, I had just about given up on the church, its view of my generation. I showed up expecting you to bash Gen Zers and Millennials. Thank you for seeing the positive in our generation. So we can talk about generations, and it's important and it's helpful, but also keep something else in mind. You, whatever generation you're part of, I'm a Gen Xer, you have far more in common with other generations than you do differences. The problem with defining millennials, Gen Xers, boomers, etc., is we focus on the differences and we put people in a box. Well, some of those differences are helpful to a degree, but you have far more in common with that 12-year-old, that 15-year-old in your church, in your community, than you do differences. That's what we focus on. Now, if you do want to understand this generation, obviously they're digital natives. They've been raised swiping smartphones and tablets before many of them could read and even speak. I'm not sure we know yet what this does to relationships and their brain. There's no coincidence that loneliness and depression and some of the issues you put up on that screen come around the same time we've had this smartphone explosion. Now, the way it affects truth, I would say this. I remember when I was a kid, some of you remember this, the Coke versus Pepsi test. Do you remember this? Now think about what this is saying. If you want a soda, how many options do you have? You really have 2 options. Now how many options do you have? Buy your own soda making machine. So the fizz and the level, the taste tailored just for you. And if you still want a Coke, you can get one with your name on it. Right? This is a generation that can have what they want, where they want it, when they want it, how they want it. It's a generation with endless options right at their fingertips. And I think this teaches a generation that you don't have to conform yourself to an external truth. You can conform reality to your own tastes and preferences. That's why I think the word in 2016, the word of the year, was post-truth. It's post-truth. It's about how you feel. It's about the individual. So that's why it's so important not to just jump into the evidence for the resurrection or evidence for creation, whatever the issue is, but to talk about what is truth, how do we know truth, why is truth important? These are the kinds of conversations. When my dad first wrote Evidence Demands a Verdict in 1972, he didn't have a whole section on truth. He's jumped right into the evidence because people assume there's a truth and you should seek it. Recently he said to me, he goes, at that time in the 60s and 70s when he started, everybody assumed there's a meaning to life. The question is, what is it? Now kids are asking a more basic question. Is there even any meaning to my life? That's the question many young people are asking. And if there's no truth, there's no meaning. That's why truth is so important.
I think at this point, we're doing well on time. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have time for probably 2 or 3.
You're the boss.
I think also I need to grab this clicker. Sean, by the way, if you guys have a question for Sean, just raise your hand. You pick someone that looks like they might have a...
Pressure is on. All right, I saw your hand first. You're up, lady. Better be good.
I'd like
I'm just kidding.
2 or 3 questions that kids have actually asked you.
2 or 3 questions kids have asked me?
Maybe some of the hardest ones.
Gosh. So let me take a step back and answer it this way. Here's what I think are the biggest questions this generation is asking. And this is backed up by Barna's Gen Z study. One would be questions of science and faith. That's huge. Second, about the seeming exclusivity of Christianity. One of the biggest virtues this generation is taught is be inclusive, don't be exclusive. Well, Jesus claimed to be the only way. So that raises unique questions about the identity of Jesus being the only way. LGBTQ questions are huge. I can't go anywhere with students without being asked about transgender, same-sex marriage, etc. And then I think one of the ways the questions have shifted, and I updating the book Evidence to my dad, I had a ton of questions for him, and he said when he used to speak on college campuses, their biggest objections were Christianity's not true. Now I think the biggest objections are that Christianity's not good.
Pause for a moment. We've got a question from someone in Arizona. They didn't give a name, but they asked this, Sean. They said, is there a good question that you use to open up a conversation with a teenager about the truth of Jesus? Like an opening question, maybe? An opening...
You know, I don't have... Look, when I look at... We're always looking for simple methods and steps to get right to Jesus. Yet when I look at the model of Jesus, he treated people very, very differently with wisdom based upon where they were at and what their barriers were to the Lord. So I'm prepared to share the gospel with a young person and have on many occasions. But typically, if I'm talking with a young person, they're open to a conversation, I'm just like, tell me what you love to do. Tell me about your life. And if I can shift it to spiritual things and they're open to it, then I want to have that conversation with them. I don't know that I have some magical question that just gets them right to Jesus. One of the best questions to ask young people is, hey, or even just say, tell me your story. I want to listen. There was a huge study last year, a show on A&E biography called Undercover High, where these students in their lower 20s went back to high school as fake high school students. They were undercover. And their big conclusion was that cell phones changed everything from just 5 years ago. And second, they said, this generation feels totally misunderstood, and they just want to carry an adult to listen to them. So that's where I start listening, showing I care, and if I can bring it to spiritual things, I'll do it as quickly as I can.
I really like how you reframe thinking about the younger generation in a positive way. About our moment, what do you think are the positive opportunities that might actually make it easier now versus in the past generations, or new ways forward now that weren't even available in the past?
Could you restate the question, by the way, so everyone can hear it?
If I understand correctly, you like how I reframed it positively. What are the easier ways to engage this generation that maybe we didn't have in the past? And that's a tough question. In some ways, I think cell phone technology has made it harder to engage this generation. In some ways, if you use certain tools, it's easier to engage young people online who will talk in a way that they won't face-to-face. And I think it makes it easier when somebody's not looking at them, seemingly judging them. They'll open up at times in a way that they might not face-to-face. So I think that's a positive technology. The downside is kids have phone and they're connected all the time, and it can easily be a barrier between us and between them. So I don't know if there's outside of technology, if there's a special way to engage this generation opposed to other generations. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But I do know that the heart of this generation, I think, is to be known and loved by someone who calls them the beloved. And that means a huge opening for an adult who essentially says, I care about you, I'm here for you, I'm going to build a relationship with you, I'm in this for the long haul. I think this generation is hungry for that, and when they sense that, they're willing to be open and share and talk about spiritual things. But that takes time, and that takes effort.
Shauna, we have a question here.
Yeah.
Do you think among Western nations, do you think that the United States will continue to be regarded as perhaps the more friendly to Christianity than perhaps the other Western nations, or are you seeing that change elsewhere?
So the question was, do I think the United States will be more friendly to Christianity than other Western nations?
As it has been historically.
As it has been historically, I am not a prophet. I work at a nonprofit organization. What I think is, here's what I know. Some of you might have seen 6 or 7 days ago, the Attorney General, William Barr, gave a speech to Notre Dame. How many of you saw his speech before Notre Dame Law School? Write it down and just go watch this. It was powerful. And he said, essentially, we are at a moment where the past 50 years there's been this outside threat, which was communism. But the framers of our government thought what would essentially destroy America, so to speak, is not from without, but from within. Would we have the moral restraint and character to withstand what comes along with freedom? And he talks, I was stunned to hear Attorney General say this. He talked boldly and out loud about an encroaching secular movement to silence religious freedom. And to hear him say it so clearly, it's on Facebook, just go watch it. Even if you end up disagreeing with him, it's a clarion call. So for him to say it that clearly, and I've seen these signs coming for a while, that I think, if I had to guess, I think this ball that's moving against religious freedom has increasing strength with the younger generations and is pushing more and more back against the church. And we will see some of those freedoms restricted. Now, here's also what I know. Christianity does well when it's not necessarily in the majority with power. So Jesus has not crawled back in the grave. God is sovereign. And, maybe there's certain things we've taken for granted. Our use of money within the church. We haven't been as strategic as we could be. That's going to get pinched a little bit. And frankly, it's going to weed out a lot of people that were just cultural Christians. That's okay. Jesus started with 12, and he turned the world upside down. So I'm just concerned, whether or not the future changes, I'm just concerned that Christians are faithful to the gospel, we don't stop speaking truth, and we love our neighbors. If we do that, then Jesus is going to say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."
So we're going to wrap up Q&A with a real simple one. We have a friend in Arizona, and the question is this: how do you guide kids who are questioning the goodness of God in light of evil and suffering in the world?
That's a great question. We had a banquet at the Christian school I teach at last night, and our speaker, Kara Powell, who's done a ton of research on this generation, shared a story about a young man, Steve, when he was 13, went to a church and asked the pastor, he said, "Does God know what finger I'm going to lift up next?" The pastor says, "Yes." Pulls out a magazine and says, "Of all the starvation and kids suffering around the world, does God know that this is happening?" The pastor's response was, "Yes, you just got to trust God." Steve Jobs turned around, walked out of a church, and never went back. That was Steve Jobs, founder of Apple. That's in his biography. So, yes, we need to trust God. That's at the heart of the message of the book of Job. But I think with this generation, it's giving them space, it's asking them questions, it's building a relationship, showing them that ultimately Christianity makes the most sense of suffering and evil, I think intellectually and existentially, but we have to live with a lot of unanswered questions and be okay with that. I think one of the worst things we can do this generation is give them a simplistic faith.
Right.
Because if there's anything this generation knows, with 1 million people having voices, that there's almost nothing that's as simple as we thought it was. So sometimes inviting young people into saying, you want to know about evil? Let's look at the person of Jesus. Let's look at how he dealt with it. Let's look at how he responded to it. Let's look at his character. Let's look at the resurrection. I can't perfectly answer your questions, but through the person of Jesus, we have more hope in addressing evil than we do anybody who's ever lived. I think when we frame it with the confidence that Christianity is true, yet recognizing there's some unanswered questions, I think number one, it's biblical. Number two, I think it works. And number three, I think it's honest. So that's how I would frame it with a young person as best I could.
On that note, as we wrap, and I shared a little bit of this with you prior to us getting on stage, but it was 2015.
Yeah.
You and your dad were in town, and you noticed that night that I was maybe a little down. And you, I remember after the dinner, you're like, "What's going on with you, man? How are you?" And a lot of people in this room that know me, they know that I went through a rough patch. The problem of evil and suffering was no longer theoretical, right? Like I had to really do business with what it means to suffer, even as a Christian who thought he was being very faithful. And you said, "Man, look, you need to get out of your head. Like, if you want to come to Colorado or to California, you can stay at my house. There's this event coming up with Dr. Turek. I think it'd be good for you." And in that moment, no offense, I thought to myself, "Yeah, he's kind of just saying that. I don't know if this is legit. We'll see what happens. Maybe, maybe not." And I'm not kidding, Sean. I don't know if you remember this, but the next day, between flights, I think, you texted me and you said, "Hey, man, I'm serious. Do you want to come hang out for a little bit? I think it'd be good for you." Now, what you didn't know was that in that moment, the months leading up to that conversation, I was kind of wrestling with calling, vocation, purpose, career. And I just, tore my ACL. I was hobbling around on crutches, you remember, and I went to stay with you.
And you were listening to Depeche Mode as well.
That's right, we listened to it in the car.
That just kind of summed it all up.
Well,
I'm like, this guy is depressed.
You said you were a fan, and I was like, oh, let me tell you about their new album. Anyway, so we went to this conference, and it revitalized my passion for not just apologetics, but just for youth ministry in general, and for what I'm, privileged to do here in this city. For as long as God's going to have me doing it.
Well, praise the
and
Lord.
I just want to say thank you.
Oh my goodness.
I really do.
Thanks.
That meant more to me. I think it's actually worth a clap.
Thanks.
This is a genuine guy, and I really appreciate what you did for me.
Well, that means a ton, and I can tell you, I do remember sensing like that just this was a difficult time for you. One of the other big reasons I did it is there's not a lot of people like you out there, Jeremy. There's not. Look, let me tell you, I get to travel and sometimes have a 30,000-foot view of the church. And there's not a lot of people that would give the presentation that you just heard saying, we're losing young people. There's a relational and an apologetic component. It's code blue. The church needs to respond. There's not a lot of people. I was just at an event called Moms in Prayer this past week. And there was 1,000 women that were there, and me. And I wasn't the only male that was there. And I said, you guys pray, you ladies pray. My request would be that you pray that God raises up workers who can speak to, counsel, write, and reach this generation. And you're one of them. So when somebody who does this is down, we got to all step in and pick them up and be a part of it. So if God does even close to what he's done, not only in your life, but in the next 10 that he's done in this 10, I'm honored to be along for the ride, and I can't wait to see. So Faith Ascent is a special ministry. Appreciate your friendship. That means a ton that you would say that. Honored to be here. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
That's cool.
Before base camp, we get a lot of kids, probably about a third of the 100 or so kids that come in every year asking for financial help. And we do a little bit of a check on their situation. We have them write an essay, their parents answer some questions, and we hear a lot of stuff from students coming in. I plan to read some of that to you. For the sake of time, I'm just going to read a couple, but this is just a few of the letters that we get coming in, excerpts from these letters. This student says, I want to come to base camp to expand my understanding of difficult and controversial topics. I believe this will help strengthen not just my own faith, but my ability to explain it to the people that I care about. This is just one of a dozen that I wanted to read to you, but almost every one of our kids come in saying, I want this, I need this, I'm having trouble finding this, and I'm glad that this is available to me. So that's what they sound like coming in. So now I want you to hear what they sound like on their way out.
Apologetics, we think of it as a dry, dusty word. It's got to be boring, right? In reality, apologetics is sort of like the meat of Christianity.
I was always told, this is true, this is true, this is true. It was very little explained why it was true. It gave me a chance to not only know what I believe, but why I believe it.
A lot of people try and live life without thought, live their faith without thought, or don't think about things, but eventually either you or someone else is going to bring up a question. Every Christian needs to know the answers to these very real, very important questions.
I can't wait to tell my friends that faith isn't about wishful thinking, it's not blind. It doesn't have to be this invisible thing.
Just being able to gain more knowledge about what I believe and then becoming confident in it. It's just really exciting.
We all have questions, and we need answers to those questions. Faith Ascent Base Camp provides answers for those questions.
It was a beautiful thing because we all of these denominations represented by these people, they just came together to what really mattered, what was in the Bible, that Jesus is God, He died and rose again for us. This is why He did it, and this is how we can prove that He did it.
So a few years ago, I started to question my faith, and I couldn't settle for the elementary school, Sunday school answer for why I believe in Christ. I've learned so much here. At Faith Ascent Base Camp, it's not like you're settling for any Sunday school answers, so I thought that was pretty cool.
When I first heard about Faith Ascent, I was actually kind of scared that it would be for all the really intellectual people who want to be deep theologians and everything like that. And I think maybe some of my friends would think that too. But no, I could just see how each of the sessions was really tailored towards what we need to hear. Topics that are very, very relevant.
I don't think there was a single teacher that I didn't enjoy listening to. You could tell everybody was extremely knowledgeable in the subject that they taught. You could tell a lot of prayer went into deciding what topics were going to be discussed. You could tell there was just a lot of intentional effort put towards everything in the camp.
It was very empowering, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning about what I believe, because before that I was guessing a lot. I mean, I did trust my parents, but I wanted to know it for myself.
This was something unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Like, you guys gave us pages for notes, but I took like 2 or 3 pages per lecture. This is the meat. This isn't for kids, for infants. This is the meat. This is for us.
Base Camp reminded me basically that you can't separate God from everything. History, science, philosophy, everything definitely speaks to the grandeur of God. Base Camp definitely has the meat that a lot of places miss. If I had learned about this a year ago, I would probably have cared a lot more about talking about it.
Base Camp is different than youth group for me because things other than Base Camp have been really shallow, and I just appreciate the depth that Base Camp has taken.
But coming to Base Camp was like, whoa, there were some things that we hadn't really talked about in youth group, hadn't really talked about in my home. I felt comfortable, and I just felt a little bit at ease. I could actually talk about the things that I had questions about. No one was really judging me. It just felt like a safe space to just talk about different things. And when I had these questions, all these massive questions, I was actually met with some pretty good answers.
So my name is Chenga. I am from Hungary, and I came to Base Camp last year for the first time. This is my second year here. I've always been very interested about apologetics and just finding answers for the questions that people ask me or questions that I face. And this camp just really helped me to face these questions and not be afraid of them, but see that there are reasonable answers to them. Also, back in Hungary in my school, with my friend, we lead a group for non-Christians, for whoever wants to come to a meeting like this. And our goal is just to see what is their interest, what are their questions, and what are some oppositions they have against Christianity. And so we just want to answer to their questions. So it didn't just help me, but also I had the opportunity to share with about 20 to 25 other students in Hungary.
It was really difficult, by the way, choosing which videos we were going to highlight, which students. If you guys want to hear other testimonies from students that have been impacted by Base Camp or other programs, just go to our website, faithascent.com. Tons of footage there, tons of interviews. You'll see people that you know. All right, so if our only ministry output was Base Camp, I think it's safe to say that many of you would still feel called to partner with us financially and support the work that we're doing here and in Arizona and apparently in Hungary too. But as I said earlier, so Base Camp is not our only program. I'm glad that you guys associate Faith Ascent with this summer camp. That means that what we're doing is working well. But there are other things that we do that complement Base Camp. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about our other programs briefly. Yes. So this is our, I don't know, you could say our program funnel. And at the top end, we have free surveys. Okay, you can read, but let me explain. These surveys are what we use to help youth pastors, Christian educators, Christian groups to get a read, an honest read, on the kinds of questions that young people are actually asking. They're anonymous surveys. It helps. After we survey a group, then what we do is, those are our surveys, is we'll assess the data, and then we'll try to link the right teacher up with the right topic, so we can maybe answer the questions that they're actually asking. And we've done, just in 2019, we've done over 20 different events. I was going to read through some of these, but suffice it to say, churches, schools, conferences, expos, we have partnered with so many different groups and other ministries. Many of these are our own events. Some of these we partnered with other parachurch organizations and educational institutions. But we've been really busy, really, really busy. Lots and lots of seminars. And the seminars, of course, help to funnel kids into small groups. In some cases, we have small group opportunities for exceptional students that really want to go deeper. Just this last year, as a matter of fact, we created, let me rephrase. J.J. Simon, Dave, J.J. Simon, and Phoebe Leach, they created a program for our Base Camp graduates that wanted to come back to Base Camp and learn better ways to facilitate small group discussion. So in addition to the small groups that I run at different churches in town, JJ and Phoebe did a small group for 6 months training future leaders so that they could facilitate small groups at Base Camp. So I'm looking forward to working, by the way, with Kylie. Where's Kylie? Oh, she's here somewhere. Yes, Kylie and JJ, we will link up after this is over. So anyway, small groups, and then of course summer camps. You know all about Base Camp. 12 camps in the last 10 years. After 2012, I believe, we started hitting 100 students locally every year, and that's a manageable number for us, by the way. But we'd like to do more. We would like to do more. Beyond that, we have what we call college connections. By the way, sorry, you guys were asking. Base Camp, save the dates, okay? Those of you that were asking over here, these are our dates for St. Louis. Save the dates. Information's available on our website. I can get you the files. I'm going to go quickly. Base Camp West, Phoenix, Arizona. Save the dates. If you know anybody out west, send them our way. It's a great opportunity for them. Really is. I was talking about college connections. So in addition to Base Camp, and this is kind of the final, leg of our tripod or stool. Not a tripod, more than that. But anyway, this is connecting students with campus ministries, all right? So let me tell you, at this age, community is 80% of the battle. There was actually a guy who did a sort of an in-house study at a big mega church, and he was trying to answer this question. What are the common characteristics of the students that stick around after 4 years of college, that they stay Christians? So he wasn't asking why do they leave, he was asking why do they stick around? 3 things. 1, they actually heard and responded to the gospel. Imagine that. They didn't just check a box or raise their hand when nobody's looking. Everybody's looking, by the way. They didn't just go down an aisle. They didn't click their heels together, right, and say magic words. Like, they actually understood Christ, prophesied, crucified for our sins, and, rising again on the 3rd day, right? Like, they got the gospel. They responded to the gospel, number 1. Number 2, they were equipped and not just entertained. we're doing a very, very good job of equipping students here, by God's grace. Our speakers, we're nothing special, but by God's grace, we're doing a very good job of equipping. And the last thing that he realized was that they were connected with healthy Christian community, preferably multi-generational. Don't give up on millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, okay? It's multi-generational. It's necessary. In a best-case scenario, they'll have a healthy church close to where they're going to school and a campus ministry that they're involved in. We work with Chi Alpha, InterVarsity, Campus Crusade. And by the way, where's JG? Are you in here, JG? Yes. By the way, you and Lee, thank you for the hard work that you do for us. Hey, these guys help us to connect our students with campus ministries wherever they land. And God willing, in the future, maybe we'll be able to train up some of our students to actually create initiatives at colleges where Crew's not represented. So we'll talk more. But anyway, all this is important, all right? These are our program outputs. Now, let's talk about our outcomes. So we have videos online. You can find those if you go to the website. Okay, so outputs, outcomes. What we found based on the most recent surveying that we've done, the most current, the most conservative, by the way, the most conservative estimates, about 79% of our base camp graduates are still professing Christians and are still active in a local church after 4 years of college. Compare that with the 40% retention. Yeah, it's worth clapping. I mean, I'm happy about this too. But now, I'm on shaky ground because I suspect that this number is actually lower than this. So let me explain. Whoa, I know I'm meeting with stakeholders and potential investors, but hear me out. Traditionally, okay, as we first started, I would personally interview students, and I'd ask them, where are you at spiritually? As our numbers grew, I started sharing this responsibility with volunteers, with other student leaders, and because we're not omniscient, we have to take our answers at face value, right? And after some hard talks with, friends like Dr. Swamidas and some other local youth pastors, I realized that this probably isn't the most effective way to get an accurate read on where our graduates are at. And I'm not here to say, that we're dealing with hundreds of liars. I believe that it's close to this number, but I think that it's possible, maybe likely, that a small percentage of our students may feel some compulsion to tell us what we want to hear, especially when it comes to church attendance. But I still remain confident that our number is far better than what we're seeing in other areas. I'm very confident in that. And so what I'm admitting to you is that we need to do this better. I need to do this better, and I need some help. We literally have mountains of student data, surveys, numbers, connections. There's a lot of really good work that we could do in terms of figuring out where they're at and why they're there and how we can adjust and course correct. Okay, there's a lot of good information there. But we need more help. We need a bigger staff. I would imagine, so we had this consultant and recruiter come into the office not long ago, and he's helping us to think through some big staffing changes, some long overdue staffing changes. And he came in, and I had my whiteboard up, right? Because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what we do in the office, what I, and historically, a part-time administrator do in the office. And I have this giant whiteboard, and he looks and he says, after, 6-hour talk, he's like, dude, he didn't say dude, but I'm, embellishing. He says, Jeremy, Mr. Smith, he says, you guys need at least 3 full-time people here for this amount of work. The outputs here, like this requires a lot more hands on deck. I said, you're probably right. You're probably right. So, what I'm asking you guys to do tonight, and it's a big ask, by the way, I'm asking you to help us meet our financial goal of $320,000. So, as it breaks down, well, you can read this for yourself. We don't have a whole lot of overhead. We don't have a lot of bulky staff situations we have to attend to. The majority of our budget is going to minister to kids. But we need more folks. We need more folks to help us out. And it's expensive. It really is. It costs money to pay people well to do a good job. And so my hope tonight, and those of you sitting at your tables here now, you should have giving cards. Kaya mentioned that in case you can't find one or if you don't have one, we actually have more people tonight than we expected. That's a good problem to have, by the way. But if you can't find a giving card, raise your hand, let us know. But the giving cards are on your table, and what we're hoping is that as you prayerfully think about what we're doing and how you might contribute, that you would help us. Looking back here, so, do the math. We have about 350 people in the room. If everybody in this room gave about $850, which is $71 per month, we would not only exceed any dinner that we've ever had, but we would be funded for next year. Now, again, I know not everybody in here can do $70 a month. And I also know that there are some people in here that could do much more than that. And so my ask tonight is that you would prayerfully consider, above and beyond what you're giving to your home church. By the way, your first charitable responsibility is your home church. So if it's going to detract from your church, just please put your pens down. First charitable responsibility is your home church, but it's not your only charitable responsibility if we're reading our Bibles correctly. So if God's moving your heart to help us, now's the time to do it. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think through how you might partner with us if God's compelling you to do that. And I'm also going to pray. So you guys can pray with me. I'm just going to ask the Holy Spirit to lead us tonight. King Jesus, I don't want anybody here to give out of fear or compulsion. I don't want anybody to feel, manipulated into doing this. I want people here, Lord, to help us out because you've really genuinely, you've put it on their heart. Maybe they've been thinking about it for months and months leading up to this event. Maybe tonight's the first time that they've ever met us. But I'm just asking, Father, that you would guide the folks in this room for your glory, but also, for our good. We've got a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. So, Father, send us those folks that feel called to help, and give us discernment and wisdom as we think through how we might respond to this opportunity. I want to close out this evening with my friend Ron. Ron, where are you? You're nearby, right? Yes, Ron, please. Longtime board member, Ron Quick, one of our favorite base camp speakers. Give it up for Ron. Actually, why don't you just tell them what's on your heart, Ron?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Just a bit of background about myself. I've been at base camp pretty much since it started. My interest in apologetics started long before that. I was about 13, 14 years old. I was at church camp, and we had a class on Christian evidences. We went over a book by someone by the name of McDowell. I can't remember the guy's name. But that was my interest in apologetics. Fast forward about 40 years, and I had no idea that I would be working in a ministry that also has had Josh and Sean McDowell involved with it as well. And over my time at Faith Ascent, there's really two things that I've seen happen. First of all, I've seen God change people. I've seen base camp be a place, like they mentioned earlier, where you have teenagers who not only have questions, but feel comfortable asking them, and they get answers from it. If we don't know the answers, we can connect them with the people who do. Everybody has questions, and every year without fail, Base Camp has been a safe place for that. God is changing people. Like they saw in the video, people in different countries are being affected by Faith Ascent. That's phenomenal. The second thing I see is I see God using people. God's had a chance to use me, use my family. My parents hang around. I go to camp every year. I stay the whole week there. I tell my wife it's because I'm a board member and I'm a speaker, so I have to stay. She laughs and says, no, you're just having fun. Okay, that's true, okay. But God is changing people, and he's using people. He's using every one of you guys in this room. Like we talked about earlier, never before have I seen, at least in my lifetime anyway, the church being attacked the way it is. Things are changing in our culture. They're changing. And Faith Ascent is reaching those people. He's using me, he's using the speakers, he's using the students, Jeremy, everybody. He's using you guys too. So please, guys, I just want to thank you for all the hard work that you guys have done. Without you, this ministry could not exist. So thank you very much.
Hey, Ron,
yes.
Do me a favor.
Yes.
Would you mind just praying us out and then dismissing everyone?
All right. God, I want to thank you that we can get together tonight for just to talk, but also to celebrate how much work you've done over the past 10 years. It is phenomenal to see what you've done. You've used people that have some gifts and some talents, but it's all you, Father. You have worked through people. That's the way you've done it for centuries. And I pray, Lord, that this ministry, that you will continue to bless it and that you'll continue to bless everybody in this room. Thank you so much for the hard work that you've done. And I pray, Father, that you give us another 10 more phenomenal years. Please keep everybody safe tonight as we go home. It's in your son's name I pray, amen. All right, guys, you're dismissed. Thank you.